Welcome to Governance Minutes, brought to you by the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member, along with contributor Thomson Reuters.
Welcome to Governance Minutes. I'm Darla Stuckey, and with me today is Scott Zdrazil, First Vice President and Director of Corporate Governance for Amalgamated Bank. Scott, we're very happy to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Today we're going to talk about proxy access, and hopefully we're going to get to some other proposals that you guys are working on this year, supporting this year. But first I want to let you do a little background for maybe some of the viewers that don't know who or what Amalgamated Bank is, what companies you own, how many assets under management, things like that. Give us your stats.
Sure. So Amalgamated Bank manages about $11 billion in assets for a variety of pension funds and other employee benefit funds. By their nature, they're long-term investors in the market, and as described in our fund's name, the long view funds, we try to take a long-term view on shareholder value. And we do so in part by engaging the companies in our portfolios, which is probably just over 3,000 companies, and try to encourage standards and practices that we believe will promote a sustainable and steady long-term performance.
Okay. Now, do you have any money that's indexed, or are you somebody managing it for you actively?
Yes. On the by and large, most of our investments are indexed or in enhanced index funds.
Okay.
So we are universal owners in that sense, that we own a large part of the marketplace.
Okay. Well, perhaps you're sort of best known right now for the shareholder proposal that you guys put in at HP in October of 2011 on proxy access. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the proposal basically tracked what was approved at the SEC, but then struck down by the courts. But it was a 3-year holding period, 3%, 25% cap. And you put it in as a precatory proposal in October at HP. Can you take yourself back in time and just tell me what you were thinking and how that came about and why you did that?
Sure. So, in our view, at the core of good governance is ensuring that there are policies and practices in place that allow investors to ensure that the directors representing them in the boardroom are accountable to those who own the firm, the share owners. Part of that can be annual elections, which we support. We support majority vote standards. But we also believe that it's good practice at companies to have a mechanism by which alternative nominees to the board can be considered, especially in situations where perhaps performance has been chronically poor, or where there's a track record of a company not being responsive to board, shareholder concerns. The Longview funds at Amalgamated Bank have long supported a universal rule by which all companies would have a provision. But in the wake of the DC Court of Appeals staying the SEC rule last year, we believed it was incumbent upon us as investors to start a discussion with companies in our portfolio about developing some type of model by which shareholders would have access to nominating alternative candidates to the proxy. So we proposed to Hewlett-Packard, in this case, that the board develop a mechanism by which holders of 3% of the company's outstanding shares be allowed to nominate up to, and who've held those shares for 3 years, be allowed to nominate up to 25% of the board. We chose that threshold in large part because it mirrored what the SEC had outlined.
Do you think there's something magic about 25%?
I think that in the standard that companies and investors agree upon at different companies might vary by the particulars. 25% to us seemed reasonable, and it would allow at least multiple directors to potentially be considered for board candidacy, that there could be a couple of new voices in a boardroom potentially. We were drawn to that. In this case, Hewlett-Packard has agreed to a management-sponsored proposal on the proxy currently that largely reflects what we had proposed, with the one modification that they are proposing a 20%, up to 20% of the board.
20%.
In the case of Hewlett-Packard, that still allows for potentially multiple new candidates to be proposed if investors saw that as fitting.
Okay, so you're right. So Hewlett-Packard now, assuming this passes, will be the first sort of major company to have proxy access in place in the private ordering context, as we say. And I'm wondering, I can't ask you if you're ever going to use it at HP, but theoretically, I mean, obviously you have done a lot of thinking about this and you like it. So you would use it. Would you use it for? Tell us exactly kind of when you might use it theoretically, not necessarily at HP, but at any company.
Sure. And I think the answer to that is twofold. First and foremost, like majority voting provisions or the ability to elect directors annually, we think that the provision of proxy access simply sends a good reinforcement message to directors that they are serving at the behest of investors. So even without investors necessarily employing the tool, it allows for directors to understand that if investors are dissatisfied, we could potentially consider alternative candidates. Okay. We don't always want majority voting because we want to vote against directors. We simply think it's a good governance practice and a safeguard.
Or proxy. A way to hold them accountable, I guess. Another way to hold them accountable.
Exactly.
And are you trying to also bring them to the table, so to speak? Is there how does this interplay with your engagement of companies? I mean, do you find that this is going to help you get companies to talk to you more?
Sure. We believe that another mechanism or another tool in the toolbox that reinforces the alignment of the directors' interests and shareholders could ultimately serve to the benefit of the company, which is in our interests over the long term as share owners. But we also think that it's a safeguard in the event that the company is not doing well. And if a board does not take actions that we believe are serving us well as investors, we'd have a mechanism in the company's bylaws that would allow us to propose alternatives. It doesn't immediately replace the directors, but it allows for a cost-effective, efficient mechanism by which we can consider some alternatives.
Okay, let's just go back for a second on precatory versus binding proposals in last year, and just give us your view on maybe why the binding proposals were less successful. I believe they were less successful from an investor standpoint.
Sure. Well, I think an important takeaway from 2012's proxy season, the first in which shareholder proposals on proxy access were allowed, was in part what model investors consider more palatable. And one was a question of precatory versus binding bylaws. But the more significant takeaway was the proposals that received the most traction and majority support followed the guidelines of the SEC outline on proxy access of 3% holders holding for 3 years.
Right.
That I think there is a general consensus, enough of a consensus that was workable. A bylaw proposal, since we are limited as proponents to 500 words by the SEC guidelines, it's difficult to get into all the minutiae of a potential bylaw. And so we opted to propose an advisory or a precatory proposal that would allow the details to be filled in later.
And okay, and that's interesting. And the details, again, we're practitioners, so the details to us are important about. We typically sit in the Nom and Gov committees and we run the process and to get directors elected. So there is a lot of process around that. And I think you also would agree that the details are also important for the company to work out. And not only can you not do it in 500 words, but maybe an investor is less suited than the company itself to put in all those bells and whistles.
Exactly, and it's not in our interest as investors to have a poorly devised bylaw on the books.
Right, right. So as far as the timing of this whole process from when you started to today, or let's fast forward to HP's annual meeting, assuming it gets put in, does that strike you as too long, too short, about the right time? Would you still happy that you did it? Satisfied with what it's gotten you so far, or what?
Sure. Well, we're very pleased that HP had a dialogue with us, and the board's been responsive to this request. And we're pleased to see that it's on the proxy. I think we anticipate that it'll pass, and we're surely going to vote for it. I think that it's proxy access. It's important to keep in mind it's not the only tool that investors have, and we always encourage both companies and investors to be actively engaged in dialogue about concerns over the business strategy or board performance, and to make use of the tools that do exist to elect responsible and responsive directors.
Okay. When you say board performance, what do you mean by that exactly?
Sure. Well, that's a large concept.
Yeah, I know. I thought I knew what you meant, and then I thought maybe I don't know what he means.
Right. In our view as investors, of course, we want the board to exercise oversight over the business strategy being implemented by management and ensuring that it's generating a sustainable long-term growth for the company.
Okay. Also, so that includes risk oversight as well, but not just share price performance.
Sure. Yes. It captures right? a lot of areas,
okay.
and
Okay.
Certainly is an area for a lively debate.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Let's move on quickly to other proposals, and I understand from our talk before that you have put in some political spend disclosure, political contributions disclosure, however you want to describe it. Can you tell us what you're thinking on that? Sort of why? What are you really trying to get? Maybe simply to our listeners.
Sure. I appreciate the question. I think it's a very current discussion for a lot of companies and a lot of investors. In our view, we believe that if a company is active in the political arena with assets from the corporation, that the board should be aware of what assets are being used in the political arena and towards what ends. And we think that it's good practice for a company to disclose the amounts of money and where they're being channeled for investors to see how their corporate assets are being used.
And is there any situations under which you think that it's good or even okay or even good for companies to spend money in the political system?
Sure. I think that's an important question. As investors, we often think for a lot of companies, it's important to be at the table and in dialogue with regulators and policymakers about which policies are suitable and sensible for that industry. So the request by many investors for disclosure does not equal a request for no spending. Okay. It's probably important to be clear on that.
Some of the proposals go further than just the political spend, obviously. Make shareholders approve everything, and that would effectively shut down spending. But you don't support those types,
right.
I guess.
Right. Our main requests for companies are to ensure that the board is exercising oversight and to disclose and be transparent.
Okay. And quickly, though, in transparency, do you want trade associations and amounts, dollar amounts and all that? Is there some sort of de minimis materiality threshold?
Sure. We believe that transparency means being fully transparent, not being selective about what's disclosed and what's not. A question of de minimis amounts is certainly reasonable. It's a small amount contributed to a small 501c4 or trade association in a local county might not meet a de minimis threshold. So I think that it's worthy of discussion of what those de minimis levels should be. But we think all categories should be equally considered and disclosed so that one channel of funding is not overridden by another opaque channel of funding. If they're corporate assets, the board should be aware of all the assets being spent, and investors should be comfortable and be informed by the volume of activity and to what ends, to help ensure that it meets with the business strategies as disclosed by the company.
Okay.
And to protect against certain risks on regulatory infractions or other kind of legal and reputational risks that come into play often when one company is active in the political arena.
Right, right. Okay, Scott, so we have to wrap up. But I will say, so I just want you to speak to our viewers. And so we have also a lot of small and mid-cap companies that don't frequently get proposals. But so what should one of our members do if they actually get a proposal from you? What's the first thing, or what advice would you give them?
So,
Whether it be proxy access or political contributions, any kind of proposal.
Right. Well, we always encourage engagement and dialogue between issuers and investors. And I think in whatever form it takes, if it's a letter or phone call or a shareholder proposal, we always encourage companies to be responsive.
So they should call you up?
Yeah, call us up.
Okay,
Talk to us.
okay, that's what I want to hear. Okay, thanks, Scott. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Join us again next time for Governance Minutes, brought to you by the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member, along with contributor Thomson Reuters.